So with that, I'd like to turn things over to another segment. So it's transitioning from our segment on invaders for sale into one on native alternatives, which is always really exciting to talk about because what we want, right, is to promote our wonderful native species, not just to remove the invasives. So I think first we will hear from Margaret Shea. Margaret, do you mind joining us? I know you have a few slides. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you.
And if you don't know Margaret, she is the owner of Dropseed Native Plant Nursery. She has a master's in ecology from Indiana University and has worked for a number of Kentucky conservation organizations before starting Dropseed Native Plant Nursery 16 years ago. Margaret's past employers include the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission, the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and Bernheim Forest. So we appreciate you joining us today, Margaret.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And today I want to talk about, if you do a lot of work to remove invasive exotics from your landscape, in some cases you can be very lucky if the invasives haven't been present for a long time. You can get a flush of native species returning from the seed bank or from dormant roots in the soil. But in many cases, when you work to remove the invasive species from your landscape, you end up with a flush of different invasive species coming in or bare soil. And so in these cases, it's a great opportunity to reintroduce native plants into that habitat. But it's really important that you make good choices of native plants that really will be effective in these disturbed areas and that can fill in and cover sort of larger areas and compete with non-native plants that are likely to come back in through the seed bank or through adjacent disturbed areas. So there is a method for sort of understanding how, sorry, I'm trying to, there we go. Understanding how sort of aggressive or easily spread native plants can be, and that's the coefficients of conservatism. And this is a ranking system that gives a rank to every native plant in Kentucky from 0 to 10, with 0 being a very weedy and aggressive species, and 10 being a species that's very faithful to a certain habitat and not prone to spread. So to give you some examples, a species listed as a 10 is the small white lady slipper orchid. And this is a species that is really faithful to wet prairies and doesn't spread well. It thrives well in that one habitat, but isn't aggressive or able to spread into other types of habitats. Another example of a plant with a high coefficient of conservatism is Rattlesnake Master. Again, a species from prairies, but from typically drier, rocky soils, but not prone to spread or be aggressive. On the other end of the scale, you have species like giant ragweed, a native plant, but one that will pretty much grow anywhere and will spread very aggressively from seed and outcompete other species very well. Another example of a very weedy native plant with a low coefficient of conservatism is cattail, which again will spread from seeds very easily and dominate areas as well. So this system was initially developed to rank the quality of natural areas. So when you go to a natural area, you get a list of every species at the site and use those rankings, those coefficients of conservatism, to get an index for the site, a floristic quality index. So in sites with a high concentration of highly ranked species or species that are truly adapted to these certain habitats, you would have a high floristic quality. Whereas in sites with a domination of low-ranked species that are just very weedy and can be found anywhere, you would have a low floristic quality for that site. But as I said, these coefficients can also be really useful in making choices about what species to use when you're replanting or restoring sites. And I think it's great to consider some of the weedier plants when you're replanting these, sites that are larger and that will have competition for non-native species over time as well, because you need that aggressiveness to sort of fill in the area and outcompete the other species. So I want to give you some examples of some of the weedier natives with maybe mid to low ranking conservation coefficients, and let you see some of those native plants that work well in disturbed areas. And I'd like to start with some of the native grasses. I think that the root structure of native grasses really helps in terms of keeping weeds out of newly planted areas. They tend to have a more fibrous root system, a dense and fibrous root system that helps keep out incoming weed species. So a combination of native grasses with native flowering plants in any type of planting can be really beneficial to the success of that planting. So one native plant that's pretty aggressive, this is actually really aggressive. And so, you want to consider that if you're doing a smaller area, you might not want to use this. But for a large area with really tough conditions, broomsedge might be a nice option. It's really a very attractive grass, which turns a nice golden brown color in the winter with the white fluffy seed heads, and a coefficient of conservatism of 2 to give you a sense of sort of how aggressive and weedy that plant can be. A native sedge that's very aggressive and good for disturbed sites, particularly wet sites, is fox sedge. And this is a really beautiful native plant. It has a lovely fountain-like shape and delicate texture. And then the nutlets turn a reddish brown, which gives it its name. They look like a little bit like a foxtail when they're mature. River oats is a really both aggressive and adaptable native grass. It's native mostly to shady areas, but will also grow in full sun. And it has a coefficient of conservatism of 4. This is a plant, we in our woods here, we have a lot of bush honeysuckle. After work to remove that, we had a big flush of garlic mustard. So we are working to control that, but at the same time have seeded the area with river oats. And that's been really effective at sort of helping to push back the garlic mustard as we work to control it. And little bluestem is a fairly aggressive native grass, a coefficient of conservatism of 4. So not so weedy as broomsedge, but also really attractive, a not too tall native grass that works well in fairly dry soils and full sun, and will spread somewhat in difficult sites. And there are also flowering plants that have that mid-range of weediness that can help in disturbed sites. And I think most of us realize that the mints can be fairly aggressive. And the mountain mint, slender mountain mint, is in fact pretty aggressive. But all of the mountain mints are just amazing in terms of attracting pollinators. They flower in sort of mid to late summer and are just covered with a huge variety of different types of pollinators when the nectar's flowing. And so it's a nice landscape plant that can be beneficial to wildlife as well. New England aster is another nice, weedy, native flowering plant. Again, a late summer flowering aster that can benefit both pollinators and birds later in the season. And a rough-leaf goldenrod. This is not quite as aggressive as Canada goldenrod, but it is a good spreader. It's a late flowering season plant that's attractive again to both insects and birds. For kind of moister spots and maybe a little bit of shade, the great blue lobelia is fairly aggressive, will spread quite a bit by seed. A close relative of it, the cardinal flower, is very popular because of its bright red flower. But it is a short-lived perennial and is also just not as aggressive. So if you don't mind the blue color over the red, it's equally good at attracting hummingbirds and pollinators, and is just tougher and better able to get established on a difficult site. And again, there are plants for shade that can also help you reestablish a shady spot that's been disturbed. Christmas fern is, again, a tough and spreading and also adaptable fern. It is not too picky in terms of the soil type or moisture. It doesn't need to have really moist, rich soil. It grows well in clay, and it also will take a little bit of sun as well. Other shade-loving perennials include the Short's Aster. This has a coefficient of conservatism of 5, so it's maybe not as aggressive as some of the other species we've talked about, but it is able to spread very well from seed and sort of compete well with other plants. And it's a really lovely fall flowering species. The native wild geranium is, again, a very tough and slightly weedy sort of plant that can compete well in disturbed areas and do well in poor soils as well. These listings are also available for all the woody plants, including trees and shrubs and vines, to give you a sense of sort of how aggressive those can be in a habitat if you're utilizing them. So some aggressive shrubs include buttonbush, which is a really beautiful native shrub that works well in wet, sunny areas. And 9-bark, a little bit less weedy with the coefficient of conservatism of 5, and maybe adapted to less wet soils, but also, again, a tough native shrub for use in disturbed areas. And then native trees as well, for example, the wild plum, which is a pretty weedy native plant, but that is wonderful for pollinators and birds as well. And an attractive understory tree that will grow in shade or in full sun. So one last thing I want to mention when you're considering native plants for disturbed areas, I think it's also important to utilize the true native species rather than cultivars. A cultivar is basically a clone of one individual that was selected for a certain trait, like its height or its petal color. But this is a picture of a collection of diverse genetic individuals of purple coneflower, the true native species, right? And so it maybe looks a little messier, not so tidy as a cultivar, but there is a lot of genetic diversity present in there besides height and petal colors. Those diverse genetics include like their ability to withstand a cold winter or withstand a drought or defend itself against an insect attack. So by using the true genetic species, rather than a cultivar, you really create a healthier group of plants that are more likely to survive in the long term in a disturbed area. So I hope I've given you some good ideas for some weedy, messy plants to add to your landscape. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margaret. We appreciate that presentation and all you do for promoting native plants in our area. You've got some great selections there. So what we're going to do with this section is we are going to take questions after our next speaker as well. And that way we'll kind of have a mini panel from both of you. And you'll see there's a question in the chat from you as well that you're welcome to answer, or we can address during the Q&A, whatever you prefer. So thank you again, Margaret, and we'll return to you in just a moment.